So welcome everyone. I am Charmain Jackman from Innocyc, and I'm excited to be partnering with Boston EdTech. And Kyle, let's have you start us off.
Sure. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everyone who joined through the meetup or the Eventbrite link. We're all happy to have you here and have this very important discussion. So a little bit about the Boston EdTech Foundation. The Boston EdTech Foundation is a totally volunteer-run nonprofit organization. We have the belief that if EdTech companies reflect our students, they are going to build better products to meet those students' needs. So our goals are to put on events like this, introduce people into companies. So we are glad you're here. Our website is bostonedtech.org, and there you can sign up as a volunteer, find out about more of our events and just what we do as an organization. So as I mentioned before, the Boston EdTech Meetup is a totally volunteer-run organization. So we do have some sponsors. Curriculum Associates is one of our corporate sponsors. And then we do have individual donors. So if you can't participate or give back to the organization as a volunteer, you could always help support and make sure we do ensure that all of our events are always free and accessible to anyone. So the funds go to help support that as well. Some of our upcoming events, we have a Boston EdTech Job and Career Fair on the 10th of November. On the 12th of November, we have Applying Education Research. And on the 17th, we're still ironing out the details, but we should be having an education research speaker to come in. They'll be talking about their researches specifically on grit and growth mindset. So for this event, we've partnered with Innocyc, and I would like to introduce the moderator for this event is Dr. Jackman. Her resume is very extensive, and I don't know what to pick, but has a lot of experience in the mental health field. She's a clinical psychologist. She's also the CEO of Innocyc and an expert in the diversity, equity, and inclusion field. So I will pass this along to her.
As Kyle mentioned, I am the founder of Innocyc Inc, which is an organization on a mission to change the face of therapy. Our goal is really to increase the visibility of therapists of color in our communities. And we do that through an engaging therapists of color directory. We also put on programming like this, where we intersect mental health with issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So very excited to be here and to have this wonderful panel. I am really looking forward to this discussion. I can't wait. So I will quickly introduce, actually I do want to have a couple more slides to share with you. This is our directory. Again, it's a national directory that features therapists of color around the country. And we also have a new product we're launching called Finding Your Sweet Spot. It's a card deck that's really geared to helping people navigate the stresses that were surrounding racial trauma, the COVID-19 election stress. So finding ways as well to engage our community. So what I will do now, I'm going to have our guests introduce themselves briefly. And I will start off with Ms. Shireen Smith. Can you say a little bit about yourself and what you do in your role and how that connects to this topic tonight?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Charmain. So I'm Shireen Smith, and I'm currently a program officer at FHI 360, and that's a human development organization. And I support the college and career readiness and juvenile justice portfolios. So for the past, I have a master's in international relations and diplomacy. And for the past 7 years, I've had the privilege of working with and supporting projects that focused on serving underserved populations globally. And that's been in the field of public health, agriculture, civil society engagement. And so really, all of the programs and practices that I've worked on are really rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's kind of my role here today, coming from that perspective. I know often diversity, equity, inclusion is only thought of maybe like in the context of a company's HR department. And really all of my professional experience has been to pursue diversity, equity, and inclusion. So really happy to be here and to be a part of this discussion today.
Thank you so much, Shireen. And I'm going to go next with Christie Lindor of Tessi Consulting. Christie, tell us a little bit about yourself and how the work that you do and how that connects to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Sure. First of all, I want to thank Charmain and Innocyc, as well as Boston EdTech, for the opportunity to connect tonight. So good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I was really impressed to see that we not only have folks in the New England area joining us tonight, but we've got folks as far as DC and Hawaii, and I've seen the West Coast. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all. So as Charmain mentioned, I am Christie Lindor, CEO of Tessi Consulting, and we are a boutique management consulting firm based in the Boston area, really focusing on working with senior leaders to create diverse, high-performing, and inclusive cultures. And I started Tessi Consulting literally before the pandemic began, but we have been working with some of the top, both mid-sized and large corporations, really focused on helping them become anti-racist and anti-sexist. Prior to starting Tessi, I spent 20 years as a management consultant working for firms like IBM, Deloitte Consulting, Ernst & Young. And in that capacity, I've done all types of different functional work from IT, performance management, strategy, mergers and acquisition. But my real love has always been human capital. And so I spent the last 10 years really focused on talent, doing DEI, different racial equity, all types of different work. Actually, before I got an opportunity to start doing that work for clients, I spent the earlier parts of my career really being in ERG groups. So being in affinity groups, professional networks, just really helping move this work internally in the companies I worked with, just because I faced a lot of, whether it's sexism, racism, ageism, you know, whatever ism, I felt like because of the intersectionalities that I identify with, I did face a lot of these. So I'm really excited to share what I've learned over the years and some of the work that we're currently doing today to really create an anti-racist corporate America.
Excellent. I love it. Cristina, too many C's tonight. Cristina Costa, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do and how that connects to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Of course. Thank you, Charmain. And earlier when you said Chris, I thought it was me too, and it was Christie. And I was like, oh, okay. So hi, everybody. My name is Cristina Costa. I also am located in Boston, Massachusetts. So a little bit about me. I currently work in learning and development at a startup that's actually in San Francisco. It's called Outco. We specifically work with job-seeking engineers. So I run the career program for our engineers. So I help them a lot with their emotional intelligence, with pitching themselves, how to answer behavioral situational questions, how to recruit and basically build their own networks, anything to help them in their job search. The mission of our company is in 2021 for the majority of our engineers to be engineers of color. So Black and brown engineers, and really trying to help get them into the best roles, you know, at the FANG companies, which is the Facebook, the Amazons, the Googles, the Netflix, all the big companies out there that are paying the big bucks and really having a huge impact on all of us, especially now in this virtual space. So a little bit more about me. I've been working in the tech industry for the past almost 7 years, which is crazy. I've worked at, you know, a few big companies like PayPal and HubSpot, a few small startups. And one of my missions is really to diversify the tech industry. And I've always been an advocate for diversity and inclusion in tech, because when I first started my career in tech back in 2014, no one looked like me. there was really no one there in the space that was diverse. And I realized, back then, wow, there's so much opportunity here. This is only going to become bigger, and I wanted to be part of the solution. And so I always took it upon myself to advocate for people, built a few of the first ERGs at a few of these big tech companies, and have kind of just always been an advocate in my own sense, not necessarily a diversity and inclusion role specifically. For the past 5 years, I'd also led an organization that I actually know Charmain from, called Women with Purpose. And we provide professional development workshops to women of color in the Boston area. And that's really how I decided to use a lot of my own privilege and my own education and background and learnings through corporate world. And I decided I wanted to share all of that with especially women, right? Women of color are the most marginalized here in this country. So that's kind of how I've always incorporated D&I and creating inclusive spaces. I am now also offering career coaching. So I do career coaching as well, specifically want to work with women, also men, but primarily women, especially navigating the unemployment space right now, which is at an all-time high. So really, really helping women navigate their careers and find a job that's going to align with your mission, vision, and values, and not just taking the first thing that you take just to take it. And then you're in a racist environment, and then in a year, you're on the job search again, right? So helping women really navigate that space and finding places that are going to support, empower, and give you the tools you need to thrive. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. Yes, and the work, and all of you, the work that you're doing is so powerful. And I had the pleasure of attending some of the Women with Purpose workshops, and to your point, really about supporting and empower women of color, in particular in the workplace. So I am going to share a slide I want to share with you, just so that we are all on the same vocabulary when it comes to some of the terms that we'll be talking about tonight. I wanted to make sure, again, that people understand. I know we kind of sometimes throw around terms. So Shireen and I actually worked on this document together, where you can see our calling in continuum. We really want to give a graphic description of those terms and how it impacts the work that we do. I'm also really invested in redefining calling out in a way that I think when people hear calling out, they think about it as a negative term, like they assume it's going to be something aggressive and adversarial. And I really want to redefine that, because the whole idea around calling out and calling in is about educating, learning, and awareness. And so we really want to emphasize that in our continuum that we developed. So as you see on the horizontal axis, I always have to remember the ocean horizontal. We have shame on one end and educate on the other end. And then on the vertical axis, we have public and private. And so again, calling out has been thrown around a lot, and we really wanted to really unpack those terms and really think about what do they actually mean. So I'll start in let's say, which one should I start with? So I'll start with calling out. So calling out is in your top right-hand corner. And this is really an opportunity, again, our model, our way of seeing it is around education and awareness. So you witness a racist statement, racist behavior, and you may use an opportunity either right there or maybe at a later point to talk to the group or the organization about the impact of the words or the behavior on people that were harmed by those statements. And so the idea is that there is a collective learning. There's a group of people or an organization that benefits from that, highlighting and centering the people who have been harmed in an incident. Calling in on the right lower corner is when this happens on a one-to-one basis, where someone might have said something. It could be in a group or a smaller setting as well, but you may pull the person aside or wait to another point, and you just have a conversation with that person. So we think of one-on-one interaction. So the idea is that there is some education that hopefully happens through that situation, but there's only one person in theory who's impacted by that or who can benefit from that education. On the other end of the spectrum, where we have shame and public, so I'll start with the lower left-hand corner. and you see silent regret. And this is a situation where, and you know, I've experienced all of the, well, not all, but most of these situations. Silent regret is where you witness some racist behavior or statements, but you don't call out that behavior in the moment. And I've been in situations where I've witnessed things, either microaggressions have been targeted towards me or someone else, and I'm at a loss for words. I'm, you know, overwhelmed by the situation, and I don't have a response in the moment. But oftentimes those situations stay with me, and I like, oh, I wish I had said something, or I wish I knew the right thing to say to have an impact. And then the top left corner is, we hear a lot about cancel culture, right? So this is when the person has been called out to the point where they're immediately thrown out of a situation, or they lose their job, they lose their position. Usually we think about people in high profile positions whose behavior people would expect better of, but there's a public exclusion from an organization or from a group by their behavior. So that's kind of our summary. And please, if you have questions or comments, please post them in the chat. If you're joining with us on Facebook, we're streaming on Facebook, so please jump in on the comments. Janae will help, and Kyle will help us to navigate the chat and bring your questions to the forefront. So that's a summary of calling out, calling in. And again, the reason that we wanted to talk about this as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we know that companies are on high alert and have been called out in some sense, or being forced to address issues of race and racism at a different level than it has been in the past. So we really wanted to talk about how we do this. And I'm in different work settings, and we've, you know, trying to figure out how do we do this, right? So there's a sense that it's no longer comfortable or okay or to just let people slide on their behavior, right? And so the idea is that we want to make sure that we're educating and communicating in ways that promotes education and awareness. The reason, again, why this is important, and I just want to say I'm a psychologist, so I have to say this, the impact of race and racism on marginalized communities and people of color has an insidious and deleterious impact that leads to racial trauma. And so we want to be mindful of, you know, when we talk about race and racism or racist behavior, it's not, and we use the word like microaggressions. And it's funny, I was listening to a TED Talk by a woman called Mona, I forgot her last name, but she was talking about people touching her here. And she was talking about, you know, we use the term microaggressions, but actually those are just racist behaviors, right? There are an impact and a result of racist behavior. So why don't we just call it that, right? We kind of create these softer words that talk around what is actually happening. So that's something for us to consider in our conversation today as well. So let me stop talking for a few minutes. I want to get you guys in the conversation. And again, Janae and Kyle, if there are questions or comments, please let us know. So I'm going to start out, and you guys either you can take it, but have you had a call out behavior in your work? I would say personal or professional life. And who wants to start?
Yeah.
Shireen? All right.
So
Got it.
I have had a situation or situations, but I can think of one where I called out. I'm laughing because you're talking about racist behavior, and it's almost like I am hesitant to say it was racist behavior. And my initial reaction was to say, well, yeah, I called out behavior, but it was just a pattern that I observed, but it was the behavior was racist. And so, yes, I do have a situation where that occurred. And I think that at that point, I'm asking myself, why did I call it out then? Because I tend to be the kind of person to keep the peace, so to speak. But I called it out at that point because I felt like I had had enough. I was at a point of frustration, but also a point of concern, because I spoke to other people of color in that organization who had been experiencing the same thing. I called it in a joking way, but it's very serious, like the monthly microaggressions or the midweek microaggressions, right? But they had been experiencing it and they had been silent. And so I got to a point where I was like, okay, it's time to say something.
I can go next. So my experience happened actually, funny enough, in an unconscious bias training that they held at a company that I worked at, one of the big tech companies. And, you know, this was quite a few years ago when kind of D&I was very new on the scene. Kind of people didn't really know what the hell they were doing. It was just kind of like, brown people need this, so let's do something about it. So I did join an unconscious bias training. It was optional. So the people who did join, it was about 40 of us in there in the space, and there was a consultant there who was, interestingly enough, a white woman, so that was a little weird, but it's fine. And she came to teach the unconscious bias training, and I remember one point, you know, we were doing an activity where we had to just share our experiences with, you know, people from different cultures, and we had to go into pairs or something. And afterwards, we all came together and we had to like reflect on what people shared. And, you know, people learned certain things from other people, like, wow, I didn't realize this person had done this or whatever it was. And then someone, a white girl said, you know, I don't see race. Race isn't, you know, it's not real. I don't see race. And I, you know, I'm a very open-minded person. And I always, sometimes it's very hard for me to keep comments to myself. And at that point, I felt that that was a learning opportunity. And so I challenged her and I said, you know, it must be nice to not have to think about race on a daily basis. And I really came at it from questioning her instead of being like, oh, what did you say? I can't believe you said that. You know, instead of making her feel defensive immediately, I decided to just rephrase it as a word. And when I said that, I mean, everyone got silent and it was kind of awkward, but then it actually fostered a discussion that people were, you know, a lot of the white people in the room felt similar. And they felt that it was a safe space that they could talk about it. And then the brown people in the room could kind of tell them like, that this is not the case for us. Right. And like it did foster that conversation. But if I hadn't said anything, I don't think anyone would have said anything. So that was an experience that I had. That was a learning opportunity. And yes, at the beginning, it was a little uncomfortable because no one likes to be called out. Right. No one likes to be challenged. But at the same time, how do you move forward if you don't challenge people's mindsets?
Yeah. And, you know, I'll let Christie go, but I do want to point and where in settings where you just shared, you opened up and you kind of took that risk. And then there are other people who agreed with you. I think you said other white people who agreed with you. And I see that as a dynamic that happens quite a bit where I am in the room and sometimes I wait to see if someone will speak up, particularly if I'm in crowd with other white folks. And more often than not, it's me who will have to speak up and say something, and it becomes tiring and emotionally draining to always have to be the one to speak up and say something. And so, you know, I definitely want to come back to that point. I'll let Christie go ahead.
Yeah, I would echo kind of what Cristina and Shireen has shared. I think because of the spaces I've always been in has historically been, you know, me being the only woman in the room, me being the only Black person in the room. And so, you know, I remember, especially, I think I used to hear it a lot more earlier in my career. I feel like as I got older and more seasoned, it was not as evident, or maybe I just became immune to it. I'm not sure. But earlier in my career, I felt like I heard it constantly. So when Shireen said the microaggression or racist behavior of the week, that was literally kind of what I experienced regularly. I think what helped me in those times, I did kind of sugarcoat it. I did kind of say, oh, it's a bias, or, you know, it's a microaggression, but it is racist behavior. And I decided that instead of it being me having to constantly kind of show and yeah, I would echo kind of what Cristina and Shireen has shared. I think because of the spaces I've always been in has historically been, you know, me being the only woman in the room, me being the only Black person in the room. And so, you know, I remember, especially, I think I used to hear it a lot more earlier in my career. I feel like as I got older and more seasoned, it was not as evident, or maybe I just became immune to it. I'm not sure. But earlier in my career, I felt like I heard it constantly. So when Shireen said the microaggression or racist behavior of the week, that was literally kind of what I experienced regularly. I think what helped me in those times, I did kind of sugarcoat it. I did kind of say, oh, it's a bias, or, you know, it's a microaggression, but it is racist behavior. And I decided that instead of it being me having to constantly kind of show and showcase like what I'm feeling, I always had this this moment where I didn't want to be the angry Black woman, right? And so I muted a lot of the things, and I created just other defense mechanisms to be able to deal with that. And to me, some of those defense mechanisms was like, well, you know, they may have something to say about, you know, my hair or whatever, or they don't think that I'm the team lead, but let me be the smartest, let me be the most prepared. You know, it made me just create more work for myself, right? Which was exhausting in and of itself. And I think about maybe about 6 or 7 years of just having these really really visceral experiences, I decided to get a little strategic. And so I started to identify, which now we call allies. I didn't know that was the word back then, but I started to identify like who are some people that I can trust and share what I'm going through, and have them be my front. Let them be with, you know, let them be the one to call things out. So for example, I had situations where I'd walk in the room and I'm one of a team of strategists going to a client, and immediately people would think that I am the, you know, the assistant, or they think that I am a junior person, when no, in fact, I'm actually one of the strategists on the team. My colleagues were very aware because I was letting them know, and they were all white men, and I would say, hey, you know, the night before, like, if someone says something, you know, do you have my back? You know, can you really help me here? And luckily, because I started to become strategic, I always had someone in front of me, you know, whether it's a male or someone else on the team, to kind of say, to kind of call it out, and call it out in a very objective way, to say, yeah, Christie is actually leading this work stream, or she is, you know, doing XYZ instead of, you know, whatever that person said. And it would be done in a very subtle way that once, you know, whoever it was, whether it was a client, whether it was another colleague, they saw how others vouched for me. That was really my defense mechanism. I had to do that not only here in the US, my work took me overseas. And I found myself having to do that in other countries where it's actually even worse, because the intersection is not only me being a Black person, but me being a woman, where there's other countries, women are just not considered superior in a leadership management role. So I constantly had to use that was like my pony, my dog and pony trick was, let me find who is my male colleague, white, Black, Indian, etc., that can vouch for me. You know, and when you think about that in hindsight, you know, that helped me survive. That helped me, you know, be able to kind of grow in my career. But it's unfortunate that, you know, I had to kind of have all these mechanisms created to just be able to just exist, just like everyone else. And I think that's really what pushed me into doing this type of work. But I not only do the calling out just from my own personal experiences, but I you know, in my work today, I help clients actually sometimes call each other out when it comes to executives with executives, or direct reports with managers, and kind of doing that training as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that. And you talk about the emotional energy and the having to work those those myths, not, I know myths, but those messages that we get, you have to work twice as hard to be as effective in your work. And that takes an emotional toll on people. And, I'm going to jump into the mental health piece of it, right? So you're not only taking on the load of the work that you're doing, but you're also adding this emotional load. I know some of you call it the black tax, the emotional tax of sometimes being in our role. So how have you navigated the emotional energy that it does take to have to work twice as hard, call out the behavior, even though other people are seeing it? Some people don't see it, right? But when people do see it and they still remain silent, how do you deal with that emotional energy around that?
I can go.
Cristina.
So I think for me, it was really, being one of the only Latina women in my tech company, right? And just feeling already the imposter syndrome 24/7, right? No one looks like me. No one can really relate to me. People have very different backgrounds, and I always kind of felt isolated. So it was tough. It was very tough for a while to navigate that space and knowing every single morning, like, okay, am I going to be good enough today, to be there? Do I deserve to be in this space, right? So what I did for myself and my own mental health, which now that in hindsight, I think back and I'm like, wow, I'm really impressed that I did that with myself, because I didn't at the time think it was mental health. I just thought it was like, okay, let me just find a refuge. That's when I really decided that outside of work, I wanted to devote a lot of my time to running Women with Purpose and to putting together these workshops and these safe, inclusive spaces for women of color, because I felt like I didn't have that in my workplace. So I really had a very distinct separation between work and like, I'm here for a paycheck. This is, paying for my life, and my outside, like, this is my passion project that I'm doing outside of work. These are the things that really fulfill me, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And so for me, I just always felt a need to give back. And I always felt that even though I am a Latina woman, I was very privileged and I was very aware of my privileges. And I wanted to always give back to other people, especially women who didn't have these privileges, right? Like, I came from a 2-parent household. I was born and raised here. Like, I'm not an immigrant, I'm first generation. I am light skinned, right? And I know that's a privilege and people don't like to admit it, but that's definitely a privilege. I just had a lot of things. Both my parents are, college educated. So there was just a lot of things that I felt I wanted to give back. And so for me, being outside of work was my refuge. In work, I made sure that I also, had like a little safe space at work as well. And that's when me and 2 other colleagues of color at one of the big tech companies I worked at actually decided to launch the first ERG, employee resource group, at that company, to create this safe space and to also invite allies to have these types of conversations. So for me, it was really just finding a group of people where I felt included and where I felt I could really be myself, and where we could all empower one another. And that for me was kind of my refuge outside of the craziness of work and kind of, feeling like an imposter all the time.
I'm gonna jump in and add.
Hold on one second. So I just want to amplify what you just shared in terms of finding a routine for self-care. Sounds like that was really important for you, and making sure that you developed a life outside of work. And you also talked about how you created a space within your work. So there were no ERGs in your company. You're like, I'm going to build it, right?
Yeah.
So those are the sort of two really powerful ways that you've dealt with that emotional tax of that. But
it was extra work. So, and that's one thing I've actually been coaching people on who are establishing ERGs at their companies. Like, you need to be compensated for that extra work. You're not about to take on all this extra responsibility on top of being the only person of color, on top of feeling the imposter syndrome, anxiety, or whatever else you're going through, and running an organization that shows that you belong to be there and not be compensated for it. Yeah. So you need help with that, hit me up. I will help you negotiate that.
Love it. Love it. Okay. All right. Christie, go ahead.
I feel like the conversation around compensation of ERGs, that's a whole panel conversation in and of itself. Because there's a lot of free labor that's going on across this country, probably in other countries, that I know I was part of it. I remember distinctly the day, kind of to Christina's point, I remember distinctly the day in my career where I stopped giving my energy to ERGs if there was not compensation. So I'm curious, Christina, of your technique on that regard. When it comes to emotional toll, kind of back to your question, Charmaine, I'm not sure if my approach was healthy. So I'd love to hear your perspective as a professional in this space, but I actually got to a point, and ERG is employee resource groups. So, some companies call them professional networks, some companies call them D&I councils or business resource groups, that sort. So that's what ERG means. I just saw that in the chat as it was coming up. So again, I don't know if so I'm going to caveat that for you, Charmaine. So I'd love to hear your perspective. I actually got to a point because of the sheer volume of just the stuff that I dealt with in this space, I actually started to use it as a superpower. And I say that meaning, you get to a point where you kind of already can tell and know if people are just going to start to underestimate you. They're gonna start to think, well, you're not, maybe you really don't know what you're, as good as you could be, or you're not as, as defined or whatever it is. And for whatever reason, whenever, I demonstrate the performance, because the work I do as a management consultant, you have to be results driven, goal oriented. That's just part of the nature of this type of business. I always was like, all right, I love being underestimated because that gives me an opportunity to really flex, my years of being in this space. And so I used to actually now use it as a way to kind of get energy and motivation, because I knew that was just what came with who I am as just being. Is it healthy? Probably not, but I did use it as a way to just rechannel energy, and it's really helped me create a competitive advantage when I look at what I've been able to accomplish in my career. It's because of literally all the haters. Like, I've literally been able to really take that energy and take it to a whole other level. So is that safe? I don't know, but that's kind of how I dealt with that emotional toll, was to just redirect it.
So it's interesting hearing both Christie and Cristina, because I'm thinking initially, I don't think I handled it well. And I continued to throw myself in the work and not really deal with the emotions that I was experiencing. And so it literally was like each incident, literally I was taking on my back. And so it was an emotional as well as a physical kind of stress that my body was going through. But I did, like Christie, kind of use that, and I really started to kind of perfect my craft and just I'm like, I'm good at this job, and let me keep me kind of, working on my art, so to speak. And the other thing, like Cristina mentioned, was that I found over time, because for months I would feel really just kind of going through the motions. That's how I would kind of describe it. But I did have to find a safe space in the office. And I did that. And then the other thing is I started to make a plan, right? In my personal time, I would make a plan and I would list out things, and these are things, because it got to a point where I almost felt like I was no longer successful, because it really took a toll on me. But then I started to make a plan. I started to find, hope in small things. And once I started to make a plan and follow through, it just seemed like everything else lined up. And so for me, it was dealing with those kind of negative emotions and that toll that it took, but then moving beyond that and actually making a plan and realizing, like, this is not, like, there's more to it than this. And I don't have to feel like I need to stay in this place and prove myself, because I know my worth. And so that's kind of the journey that I went through.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, thank you all for just sharing those experiences. I know I went there, I'm a psychologist, so I was going to go there. And so you talked about the range of just emotions. There's some people in the chat, right? So you know, Shireen, I don't know for you if that was depression, if you would name it depression, but I know for some people that can definitely turn into depression where you don't feel valued in the work that you do. And sometimes it's work that you dreamed of doing from young, and then you get to a place and you're not accepted, you're not affirmed. And that can be really, really devastating for people when you don't find or don't have a place at work or feel valued by your work. You question, I know, Christine, you talked about the imposter syndrome, right? You then doubt yourself. It's like, well, am I really good? Like, should I even be here? And so that can just lead to a downward spiral. So thank you for sharing that. And, you know, one of the things I definitely want to promote, you know, Innocyc, one of the things we do have is a free therapist of color directory. And so if you are feeling having those experiences at work where you're experiencing depression or anxiety, definitely kind of reach out and get support through that. I want to just go to the chat a bit. We have lots of activity and some questions. So Desiree shared, from my personal experience, I've dealt with being one of a few people of color in a company. She still is. And it's super difficult trying to find people who will accept and respect you for you and won't scrutinize you and threaten you or treat you, any differently due to the color of your skin. It's a toxic plague that definitely needs to be cured. So yes, and I think many of us can really agree to that. Thank you for sharing that, Desiree. And hopefully you've heard some things that might shift or think about ways that you might be able to advocate for yourself in your workplace. We explained what ERGs are. Some people call them affinity groups as well. Debbie says, do you find it harder to handle this emotional toll during this George Floyd time? Maybe you could handle it before, but now it's like perpetual exhaustion. And thank you for raising that, Debbie. I definitely want to underscore that. And, you know, we have seen a different response in response to George Floyd's death, right? It has really propelled a national movement against police brutality, but also again has, you know, kind of force organizations to also look at their practices and policies and structures. We see organizations like the NBA, right, really take a stand, and they had all the uniforms. And again, how do we make sure that this momentum maintains and goes deep, right, not just stays at the superficial end? There's also a comment from, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce the name. For me, it's also coming to terms with being isolated in terms of identity and ideology or politics. Very few people at my higher education institutions share my politics, even with the BIPOC community, where some share my identities. They agree with more dominant ideologies and have assimilated to varying degrees, rather than acting from a liberation practice. So it further complicates calling out folks if people don't share those combined aspects of who I am. And I'm going to break that down, right? That's kind of all skin folk ain't king folk, right? We've heard that. So sometimes there are people who look like you who may not share, may not identify or connect with that aspect of their culture, their identity. And you may look to them as allies or supporters, and they'll be like, skirt, like they don't, you know, they don't want to be near you, right? So let's talk about that. What happens when you think someone is with you, like you guys are down, and then you find out you're not? Have you had to deal with a situation? I see you guys nodding, so I'm assuming yes. Who wants to take that? Cristina?
What was the question, Charmaine? How do we handle that? Or
yeah. How do you deal with? What do you do with that? You just keep it moving.
So the situation that I was in, where I found that out, was actually from leadership. There was a leader who was a person of color, who I thought cared about people of color, who I thought was there to create a diverse workforce and really be an innovative company in the tech space. And, I was very surprised I was very taken aback in a way that I did not expect to be, where we actually every week he would take a group of people, like 5 people, on a lunch date to get to know the employees, right? He was CEO of this company. So we went on a lunch date, and I remember I was just so interested in learning about his background, because he came from a very like low income, Latino background, had all this extensive experience, and had all these positions of power in the tech industry. And I really looked up to him. And after the conversation at that lunch with several other, me and 4 white employees, me and this person, and just from that conversation, I learned that this diversity was not at all a priority for him whatsoever. He didn't even identify as a person of color, and was very uncomfortable when I asked him certain questions about his upbringing and just like how he got into what he got into. And ultimately, he actually told someone else who then told me that to be careful around him and to not ask him these questions that made him uncomfortable, and that I asked too many questions. And that's when I realized then and there, I was like, yeah, okay, this comes from the top down, right? If this is an issue with the top senior leadership, there's not gonna be any needle to move here. And that's when I realized I had to go. And that's when I really determined, okay, leadership's not on board at all with this. And if someone's values, it's very, very difficult to change someone's values and to change someone's mindset when it comes to their mission and their vision and their values. And I had a front row ticket to see what this person's mission, vision, and values were, and they did not align with mine, hence why the whole conversation was uncomfortable. And I then realized, okay, if this person doesn't care, they're not going to invest into it, right? They're not going to invest into diversity and inclusion, because D&I is a business need, right? And it needs to have a budget. It can't just be, oh, let's just have a nice ERG where the Black and brown people can hang out. Like, no, like there needs to be objectives, right? Retention, hiring objectives, promotional objectives. Like, what is this going to look like so that people stay, right? So that you retain your diverse talent. You're not just hiring people to be entry level customer support, but they're actually in C-suite level. They're getting promoted to management. They're getting promoted to executive, whatever it is, right? So I realized at that time, I was like, yeah, this is not the place for me. I was actually fired from that company for not being a culture fit, even though I was the culture, but it's fine. And it's fine. And you know what? It was a blessing in disguise. So I will say, I'm not going to sugarcoat shit for people here, but like a lot of times, if you do advocate for yourself and leadership is not on board, that could mean your job. And I don't want to pretend that it's not, because it could happen. Right? And sometimes it may not be worth that risk for you. So yeah, that was my situation.
I'd like to jump in on something that you said about kind of the need to really understand, like you need to know when your mission and vision, your personal and the organizations don't align, and when it's time to go, right? And I recall when a previous organization that I was with, when I joined, and I noticed that there was a woman of color in leadership, and I got really excited. And I said, this is amazing, because it means that for me, that signal, this company is open, and people of color, can get a seat at the table. But that was not the case, because I remember when I mentioned it to another colleague, and I said, it's so encouraging. I'm new to this company, but it's so encouraging that, leadership is so diverse. And they said, what are you talking about? And I'm like, oh, like that person, they're, and they said, no, they're not. And I'm like, no, but I'm pretty sure, like, I think she looks like me, like she's a person of color. And they said, no, and went into like this internal investigation, because what was I saying? I was saying that there was someone in leadership that was Black. Like, what are you saying? And come to find out, then they asked someone else that was in senior management position. The person said, yes, she is, but she doesn't like people to know. So she was passing, basically. and no one knew that she was biracial. But when I saw her, I saw one of my people, right? And so I was so encouraged. But for me, that signal for me, okay, if you have been working with an organization for so long, you're now at the C-suite level and you cannot identify, like you, I mean, it could be on a personal level, but I felt like that also was indicative of the type of organization. And then when I combined that with the midweek microaggressions and just everything, for me, it signaled, okay, it's time to kind of pack up and look elsewhere, because it's, you know, if the head is bad, then yeah.
Think that if it stinks from the head, is that the fish thing? Yeah. So there are a lot of questions about, okay, so how do you actually do it, right? So people want the skill. So how do you actually do it? And I think it's really important. We've talked a little bit about what are the things you need to consider, right? So one, you guys named, like, are you willing to lose your job over this, calling out someone? Like, are you willing to lose your job? And I think it sounds like depends. Maybe for some people, yes, right? If the philosophy or the values of the organization or the practices are in a situation where I am devalued, then I can't, and I speak up, or I'm worried about speaking up, then maybe it's not a good fit. But I'd love to hear, what are some things that you think about prior to calling out? Is it spontaneous? Is it something that's more thoughtful? Do you think about the timing, your emotional energy, who is present or who's not present? Yeah, let's talk a little bit about what are the criteria that you use in deciding when and how to call out racist behavior.
I can kind of kick off the conversation, and Shireen and Cristina would love to hear your perspectives. I go back to it being, you kind of got to think strategically, and unfortunately, because of what we've all, you know, many of us, I shouldn't say all, but many of us have faced, you kind of almost have to have these defenses and these ideas lined up, because you don't know when you're going to kind of face them. But I think a couple of things when it comes to calling out specifically. So strategically, I think you have to keep the emotion out of it. And it's hard. I'm not even going to lie and say that that's an easy thing to do, especially when you got someone trying to touch your hair. Or I remember situations where it would be me and maybe a couple other like Black people were talking, and leadership they look paranoid that we're like collecting and talking together. Obviously now we're in COVID, you know, we're not talking in the hall, but I remember there was, you know, all these like little microaggressions. But I think it's really being able to speak and address certain things in a very calm manner and making it human. And I say that kind of because I think sometimes when we think objective, that means we got to start to spew out facts and figures and that sort. No, I think it's more of, you know, really making it real and focusing on the impact of how certain words may have made you feel or certain actions have made you feel, but in an objective way to do so. But going back to being strategic, I think it depends on who that person is that has shared those, you know, whatever the sentiments is. So for example, with the situation with Cristina, you know, Cristina talked about, you know, kind of maybe conversations she had with the CEO. The buck stops with the CEO, as Cristina says. And so you already know if that's the sentiment of your utmost senior leadership. Well, yes, you can share your perspectives with others on how you felt privately. You may, if you feel that you have that type of relationship, or you can kind of create that dynamic with that individual, you know, I think, yes, you can do so. But there may be instances where you're like, you know what? This person's far gone. I don't want to invest the energy or time into calling it out to them. It just, you know, or maybe I'm too new, or maybe I'm too junior. So I think you have to make a choice as to, you know, if this is something you're in it for the long term. If you're in it for the long term, then you can start to kind of figure out who are some ways you can create a collective to kind of help call certain things out. It's easy to call certain kind of behaviors out as a group than it is to do one-on-one sometimes. So you kind of got to think strategically about what makes sense and when and how, depending on what's your career goals at that company. So I think, someone mentioned, is calling out worth getting fired? That's really a question you have to ask yourself, where you are in your career, or is calling out something I can do to help move this organization forward. And I know based on the dynamics and who said what and how that worked, I can make that happen with the right people in my corner. So I think you got to think about what it means, how you can call it out in a way that makes it real to make the person really see kind of where they're coming from. And figuring out how can you get those allies. So I mentioned to you before, that was my go-to card. I always went out and said, how can I find allies to speak on my behalf? But I think there's just a lot of factors. There's not like a one size fit all way to call out, but I think understanding what the different techniques are and options that you have really goes a long way. And definitely working, playing things back with people. I know that sometimes people's first inclination is to run to HR. HR is not always the answer initially to these types of things. So you got to remember what HR's role is. HR is designed to support and mitigate the risks and the interests of that company. They're not always specifically for you, when I say you as in like an individual employee. They're looking at the collective, so they have to have a little bit of a more objective opinion. So one, running to HR is not always the right answer yet, but also two, keeping the emotion out of it. And then three, thinking about, okay, the person that you're trying to call out, does it make sense? I love your continuum, Charmain. Does it make sense to call them out in public and it be a teachable moment? Or is it let me connect with you one-on-one and let you know how you made me feel? So I feel like that was long, but hopefully that gave a little bit of insight.
Yeah, and I'm curious to hear what Cristina and Shireen has to say. And one of the things I was having this conversation with a colleague earlier this week about, I know you talked about calm and kind of having to have your thoughts together. And there's this, and I'll say this, right? Everybody has to do what feels right and comfortable for them, right? So if you are calm, if calmness and that's part of your brand and your culture and your personality, that's going to work for you. But there's also this piece around, we have to, I'll mention this tone policing, right? So we have to put it in a way that is palatable for white folks, right? And so why is showing our emotion, like if you are hurt or frustrated in that moment, why can't we just be our authentic selves in that moment when we're calling out? And again, calling out doesn't mean you're going off and you're going to cuss somebody out, right? That's not the point. But how can you generally share your emotions and what you're feeling? I'll turn it over to Cristina. What do you have to say about how have you done it? What do you recommend for people to think about in their decision about calling out?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I agree with Christie, right? There's a time and a place for things. And you do have to be cognizant that if you do say something in a certain way, people can become immediately defensive, right? So much of what we do, actually, like, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. That is literally like one of the most important learnings I've learned in just life, right? For anything, right? Even when you negotiate, it's all about how you word things, right? How do you express it in a way that people absorb it and take it and understand it, right? So it's easy to, in my opinion, it's very easy to cuss someone out. And I'm very good at that. I can cuss people out very easily, right? But then when you look back on it, okay, did it resonate with them though? Or did they just pay attention to the fact that I was screaming at them and they could see that I was angry, but they didn't really understand the point, right? Because they're too afraid of the anger and being defensive immediately because I'm coming at them with all of this, jargon and loud voice, because I can get real loud, right? So I've learned that there's definitely power in being able to channel your emotion and really contain it. And as much as people think that's maybe belittling or taking away from your voice, it's actually not. Like, even we saw recently in the vice presidential elections, right? Even Kamala had to refrain so much from showing her emotions because she didn't want to scare white folks. Let's be real. that's why she did it, right? We know she had a lot of passion and emotion in the things that she wanted to say, but God forbid we scare people with our emotions, right? People who are not comfortable with them. So it really does come from a place of, being able to channel your emotions so that you can be very clear in the point that you're trying to get across. And something that I've also found very helpful is really turning questions back around on somebody. So if somebody says something that's somewhat racist or discriminatory or judgmental or something, just really flipping that question and asking them, like, well, what makes you think that? Why do you believe that? Can you explain to me? I'm trying to understand your thought process. Can you please tell me? And I'm telling you right now, asking those kind of questions and keeping it very top level and twisting it back on them will honestly make a lot of people feel very, number one, dumb, because they're gonna be like, oh shit, she's right. Like this belief comes from my bias or comes from a movie I saw or is actually not valid at all. And now I have to explain to her why, and it gets people to really start thinking about their own thoughts and really challenging their own thoughts, right? That they maybe never would have challenged before if you hadn't said anything. So I would say it's definitely a time and a place situation, right? Take it, if you're in a C-suite level room and it's all the executive team, like, do you want to be that person who calls someone out and then you're going to have to deal with the repercussions? Or do you maybe want to say, hey, I think later on, maybe send an email about the situation, or maybe talk to one person one-on-one and let them know, or maybe even offer, hey, you know what, I think we need some diversity training. I know some great consultants that could offer some to us, right? So it's really time and place, but honestly, being able to channel your emotion, being able to control it is a power. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, so I'd kind of reiterate everything that was said, but I really think the emotion part is really important. I think that when it comes to considering calling out, you have to be, whoever is calling out has to be very clear about what is the outcome that you're looking for, what is the intent of you calling out. And I think that needs to be the starting place. And if you're looking at learning to be the outcome, so that over time this behavior that is offensive will change. If it is to bring awareness, then the way that you approach the call out is going to be different. There are times where I have chosen to remain silent because I knew that if I said something, it would not be coming from a place, it would be coming from pure emotion, it would be coming from a place of anger, and it would not be constructive or productive. And as Christie and Cristina, you've said, it is really about how you deliver that message. The other thing is that I think in calling out behavior, you mentioned about making a suggestion, Cristina, about diversity training, and maybe you identify an observation and not necessarily a problem. You say, this is what I've observed, and here are some recommendations, or here are some solutions. So you don't only come as, oh, this person is always identifying problems, there's always an issue, but oh, there's a solution. So that's another approach that I would recommend. And then this is very difficult, but you have to almost separate the person and the behavior. And you have to speak to the behavior and not be, because if you come at the person, it's more like accusatory, then it becomes kind of a high conflict type of situation, and then nothing happens, right? So so that kind of would be my approach to how to navigate that.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you all. And there's a lot of chatter in comments in the chat about who I am, and my anger, my emotion, like I'm being blamed for having an emotional reaction to an offensive racist remark, right? So that is kind of the dilemma. And I think we're at this point where we're at a turning point where we need folks to understand, to kind of recognize the white fragility. And white fragility is that response. Robin Dion, I don't know if she coined it, but she talks about, well, she has a whole book written about it. But the whole idea that any feedback about your behavior along racist lines, the person just falls apart. Or they kind of become defensive and blame you, right? So the education is around how do you take feedback about your racist behavior? And so some of the work that I am doing in organizations that I consult to, I am naming the calling out, calling in, and talking to the organization and employees about how do you create a culture of calling in and calling out at your organization. So we need to get people to understand what the goal of calling out is, right? It is about education and awareness. It's not about calling you a bad person because you made a racist remark, right? That whole, I'm a good person, so I can't be racist. No, right? Not, there's a lot of books around deconstructing that. So we really need to kind of create this framework where people are able to call out behavior. And again, you know, how do you show your and I get emotional, I get passionate when I'm talking at my board meetings or organizations. So I'm not sure how that comes off to people, but it's hard for me to be calm in those moments. And, you know, because I'm feeling what's happening. And so I also want to give space for that. But it doesn't mean you have to respond right there, right? If you're having a reaction or getting triggered, you can say, this is not okay, and we need to talk about this, but I can't have the conversation right now, but we're gonna have the conversation, right? So maybe you make a note that this is not okay, and you come back to it at a time where you can get your thoughts together. I know when I'm triggered, activated, like I'm flooded. So I don't think clearly, I can't express things in the way I need to. So I also want to recognize for folks that, again, some of us are really quick, you know, you got it right there, and some of us need time, but how do you mark that moment? This is not okay, and we need to come back to the conversation. Anything, there's lots, there's lots in the chat. So let's see if we can bring some comments. Right, so yeah, lots of comments about.
Charmain, I just have one thing to add,
Sure.
especially for people who may be experiencing discrimination at work right now. And I know, you know, HR, as Christie mentioned, isn't always going to be on your side, but sometimes they are. And so I know through my experiences that with a boss, with a manager who always expressed a lot of microaggressions and was very much not a supportive manager at all, very micromanaging as well. Just, it was hell. It was just horrible working for her. I actually learned from my mom because my mom had gone through this before, right? My mom had gone through the same stuff, worse even in the 70s and 80s, right? And she told me, she was like, you need to just have everything in writing, like absolutely anything. So if someone says a racial remark or says something that's really inappropriate, maybe they said it in your face, you can maybe email them, be like, hey, you know, that remark that you said this, and this yesterday really bothered me. Please don't do that again. And if they write something back, you know, even worse or something, then you have a paper trail, right? So you really have to make sure you have everything in writing. I've even worked with the lawyers for civil rights on this and like asked them, like the racial discrimination attorneys that work in racial discrimination cases. We actually hosted them at Women with Purpose at one of our events on how to protect yourself in the workplace, whether you're being sexually discriminated against, who knows, sexual harassment, racial discrimination, whatever it is, you just want to make sure you have a paper trail. And I know this sounds horrible because like they're not going to believe you. It's just words. And trust me, I've tried, right? So I had to learn that on my own. So I would say for anyone who's going through that, or anyone feeling racially discriminated against, and they do have the receipts, keep those receipts and do show them to your HR, whoever is your head of HR or HR partner or whatever it is.
I
And
want
for those who are not millennials, receipts are your documents, your documentation. So
before Charmaine, before we
go ahead.
go on, I want to clarify something on the HR comment. I completely agree with Christina. If it's not in writing, it does not exist. Totally agree with that. When I made the reference about HR, what I've heard, and just from my mentees and people I've talked to, there's this sometimes an assumption that going to HR means that I'm automatically going to have someone have my back.
Right.
And that is not always the case. And so I agree with Christina in that, yes, you definitely want to connect with HR when it makes sense, but HR should be kind of the next offense, not the first offense. You know, you want to kind of think who is a mentor, if it's someone in the organization, your boss, like who else you can connect with, have your receipts, document, but HR, you know, don't go in with HR saying, okay, yes, I'm going to tell them and they're going to take care of this and I'm good. You know, you'll be disappointed. So I just want to kind of clarify that piece. And the last piece on this, leaders. So we've been talking a lot about individuals and they're facing it, but there's an accountability from a leadership perspective. And so for leaders that are listening to this, or if you are going back to your leadership and taking this, if there's any discrimination or racism that's being faced in the organization, leaders have to be declarative on what is the stance of that company's tolerance or non-tolerance to racist behavior moving forward. So there has to be role modeling at the leadership level to ensure that if this happens, it's a teachable moment that can be amplified and leadership can really reinforce the messaging that this is not tolerated in this organization. And my thing is, going back to HR, it shouldn't be just HR being the face of these issues. Leadership has to stand with HR to say that, you know what, we're moving towards anti-racist. This is not tolerated, and this is what this means, and this is how we're going to hold people accountable. Because guess what? When you don't have leaders holding individuals accountable, this is going to happen time and time and time again, and we're going to just be in the same situation. So I want to kind of really implore leaders, be courageous, be declarative. If you are in a position of power, use that to your advantage to really help move the needle and help your employees be able to thrive.
Right. Awesome. So, and one of the comments Irvine is also mentioned, sometimes the racist behavior is not a person or not a statement from a person, but it's actually a policy, right? And so my next question kind of speaks to that and kind of picks up from where you just left off, Christie. So what happens if it's someone in leadership who makes the racist statement or exhibits the racist behavior? How can someone in a position, not a leadership position, manage and navigate that situation? I know I'm giving you guys curveballs here.
Well, I guess I can take it. So how to deal with leadership, they say something racist.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen this time and time again. That's why I'm like, which example should I think of? So I would say, you know, sponsors are really important, as Christie mentioned, right? Having people at the company that you know have your back, right? People who are maybe higher up, whether that's higher up management, somebody on the C-suite. And I would, you know, I actually did call out a CEO for doing something. It wasn't that he did something racist or said something necessarily racist. This was around the time of the when Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, and there was a lot of, you know, press in the media about it. People were in outrage about it, and no one at the company even discussed it or acted like it even happened. And I remember we even had like our yearly company conference or our yearly company meeting. So all the employees were there, and it was literally maybe a few days after the shooting happened, and nothing was addressed. It wasn't even a topic of discussion. And me and two other colleagues were really distraught about it. We were very, very much, you know, feeling so excluded, feeling unheard, feeling like no one cared what happened to Black and brown people, even though, you know, 10% of the employees that worked there were people of color, and we just felt silenced. And me and 2 other colleagues, we decided, hey, we're going to write a letter. We're going to write a letter directly going to the CEO and the CPO, which, just so you guys know, that's the chief people officer. That's like head of people or whatever. And we decided to write a very heartfelt letter about how disappointed we were in the lack of acknowledgement that this is happening to the brown community, and that our company is global. It's an international company. We work with clients from all over the world, and we should have more diverse perspectives and innovation. If we want to be an innovative company, we should have the most diverse workforce, right? To have the most diverse perspectives and cultural backgrounds and all of that. And we really just told them, we were very disappointed in how it was handled, that we felt silenced, we felt like we didn't matter. And that actually led up to the ERG that I was talking about that we developed. That's actually how it started. It started with us taking a stand, writing a letter, and the letter was actually addressed to the CEO and the CPO, which then resulted in an email that went out to the entire company to discuss what had happened in Ferguson and to discuss that they were standing in solidarity with Black lives. So that's how we did it. Again, it could have been very risky. It could have been taken very badly, right? And it could have been, hey, you guys don't have to work here anymore. But again, I kind of always been a little bit of a rebel. I've always had an issue with authority and people trying to tell me what to do. And so I was like, this doesn't feel right. And they need to know that this doesn't feel right. And, if we don't say something, who will? So that was my.
Ask you, Cristina, who signed the letter?
Who signed it?
Yeah.
Well, it was an email. It was an email.
Okay. And it came from whose
account? It was from me and my 2 colleagues. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking anonymous letter, probably. No,
it wasn't anonymous. We let them know who, There was 3 of us.
Yeah. And I think that is powerful and I've had to write, I write letters. I'm able to process my thoughts, and I've used letters as a point to challenge practices at some of the organizations that I've been a part of, not necessarily where I was an employee, but also someone who was impacted by policies and practices and the culture of a place. And that has been powerful to be able to get people together and do that in solidarity, I think helps. So I want to be close to the end of time. One last question I want to open up for any questions. So we talked a little bit about white fragility, but what do you want to say to kind of your white colleagues, your white counterparts about how to take feedback about their racist behavior? How do they get in a stance where they can hear and use that information as a point to change or think about or reflect on their practice, their statements and their behavior? What are some things you think are white folks, white people who want to be allies, what do they need to do when they are presented with feedback about their statements or behavior?
I mean, it's gonna sound really basic, but I think just first off, like respect, just respect what is being said. So come from a place of, and it's hard to say like not to be defensive. And I always talk about, again, like separating the behavior from the person, but I think that it's really important for both the person delivering the feedback as well as receiving. You have to be able to recognize, okay, I'm not being attacked. It's not me, but we're speaking about the behavior. I feel like that is so important for both ends. The other thing is empathy. Is really, really important because it is so, again, like it's almost automatic, or it's what is the word I'm looking for? I can't even remember, but it's automatic to basically kind of be on the defensive, right? It's a reflex kind of response. And so you want to first start off from a place of, okay, let me really try to focus on what is being said. Look at the behavior. It's not an attack on me. And then let me try to actually put myself in that person's position to see where they're coming from. And it is something so simple. It's really difficult to do, but it is really important because change doesn't happen if you don't see a need for it. So you really have to take on take on the role of that person in a sense. Try to put yourself in their position and really be really understanding, be empathetic, and understand that it's not an attack on you, but it's about a behavior that is causing hurt that we're trying to change. And just be open to learning and be open to not assuming that you know everything, because we don't.
Great, thank you for that.
I'll add to what Shireen just said so nicely there. Just three separate thoughts. I think the one thing for colleagues, I think is really, for white colleagues, really understanding the importance of impact versus intent. And ensuring that even if you meant the best, you know, and yes, you have Black friends and you have a Black spouse, and however, you know, it's not about, you know, the intent of your words or your action, but the impact that it's made the other feel. So I think keeping that centered is important. I think the second part of that is education. So, you know, this is a topic I'm glad that I'm glad to see that, you know, from a DEI perspective, we're finally in an environment where we can talk about like white privilege. We can talk about these things, because for so long they were swept under the rug, to be quite honest. But I think this is a really interesting time in history where, you know, I think white colleagues, you know, take the time and start to educate yourself around this topic. The book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Imran Kendi is an amazing first step. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. Those are really great resources. You don't need a lot, you just need a couple, and just kind of, you know, dive in deep and ask questions. And then the third thing I think is understanding that you're going to make mistakes. You know, I think it's not practical to say that everyone is going to be perfect in this space, right? When we talk about impact versus intent, but understanding that in your growing, in your journey and learning, is practicing what to do when you do make mistakes. And there is this, and I'm sure if you Google it, there is there's an exercise, it's called boots and sandals. So think about if you stepped on someone's toes, you know, if with the weight of your privilege is a boot and it steps on someone's toes, and you've said something racist, like, what do you do? So think about just in everyday life, what do you do when you step on someone's feet, right? First, you take your feet off, right? So you stop the instance. You then ask them, are you okay, right? So you center the impact on that individual, and then you apologize, right? And you say, you know what, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but you learn from it, right? And you listen to how you stepping on that person's toes may have made them feel like, ouch, that hurt, or whatever. So think about that as a framework. So when you do make mistakes, if you're in this work, you're going to make mistakes. Being comfortable and growing and leaning into that and taking that as teachable moments, but moving on, and not that being an excuse to not say anything or not to talk to that person anymore, or to just change your dynamics with certain things because of that one instance.
I'll give my 2 cents. I agree with both ladies. I think, you know, so much of the burden of these conversations and the history ends up falling on our shoulders and us having to educate others, when I think a lot more of that burden should be on white people to educate themselves. So I agree with that. I also like to start my conversations with really explaining what listening means, because active listening, you're listening to understand, not listening to speak. A lot of people just listen so that they can talk, right? And they're not actually absorbing what it is that you're saying and taking the time to try and understand your point of view. So I really try to come at it from a place of, you know, I'm telling you these things from my perspective and my life experience that you have no idea what it's like, because you are not me, right? You don't know what it's like to be a person of color in the US. If you're a white person, you have no idea. So you need to listen. You need to shut up and listen, right? And it's not coming from a place of, I'm trying to be mean, or I'm demeaning you, or I'm attacking you, but it's coming from a place that we have our entire lives lived in this country that was built for people like you to succeed and for people like me not to. And so you need to understand that when I'm telling you things from a certain perspective, that you're not going to relate to it. So you just need to listen. And I think really being able to have those open conversations and even asking them, you know, if you have questions, this is a safe space to ask those questions, right? No questions are too dumb or ignorant or whatever it is. Like, this is a safe space that I'm going to tell you things that maybe you might not like to hear. But there's a lot of things in this country that have happened to people like us that maybe you had no idea about, and you need to know, because this veil across your eyes needs to be taken off. Right? We are now, I've called 2020, in my opinion, 2020 has been the year of the awakening. I think a lot of people have awoken to things. And now we're feeling a lot more safe and vulnerable to have these conversations, because at the end of the day, we don't have these conversations, nothing changes.
Right.
So that's for me.
Thank you. So I'll open up with one question. This has been a really great conversation, and thank you for the engagement. If someone has a burning question, we'll take that real quick before we wrap up. All right, we're gonna just wrap up then. So I want to just highlight just some of the learnings that I got from this. I'm so glad this is recorded. I'm gonna listen to this over and over again. Thank you guys for being vulnerable and for, you know, just sharing it and being honest about what you've experienced. So I think one of the things we want to highlight in calling out is really about centering the person and the people who've been harmed, right? So have them in mind and care about them first. I love that analogy that you shared, Christie. I'd never heard of that one, but it makes so much sense. I'm like, why hadn't I thought about that one before? So making sure that you acknowledge the harm, you say sorry, and do better, right? Just do better. Like the point of this, you know, again, at this conversation is to really redefine calling out. It's not about putting people on blast and shaming people, right? It's really about education and awareness and action, right? What are you going to do differently next time? So listening, really taking in, I love that, taking in the information that you're getting, but then doing something with it. I don't want you just sitting around with it and just feeling sorry for yourself. I want you to like act and do different, tell other people, right? Let it go viral. I made this mistake and this is how I'm going to change it. You know, this is a lifelong journey. Like, we're all learning, we're all making mistakes. I make mistakes in this work. I learn and I take it on and I share with other people. I'm vulnerable in the what I learn, but I'm also generous in sharing it with other people. And that's what we ask for you. And I love Shireen's comment about separating the person and the behavior. I think people get so caught up, I'm not racist, I'm a good person. Or, you know, we can villainize people, right? Because they should be awoken and they should be aware of these things. And some of them, unfortunately, are not, because they didn't have conversations till they were in college, if then. So being able to separate the person from the behavior, you learn, you know, as a parent, you have to do that, right? And so that is another great point that you guys shared. So thank you again for all your time and your wonderful gems that you shared, but most of all, your vulnerability in sharing and being in a space and sharing things that you've had to deal with that, you know, were tough. So just thank you all. In terms of resources, Janae, you want to share again? I advocate for therapy. You don't have to wait till something's wrong to see a therapist. So again, check out Innocyc. We have a wonderful therapist of color directory for these things and for talking and problem solving and sharing. And thank you for your time.